She spent her whole life avoiding doctors until she met this one. For years, she trusted no one in a white coat, carrying a pain too deep to explain. But when a soft-spoken young doctor shows up in her village, everything begins to change. He isn't like the others. He listens, he cares, and he sees past the walls she's built. Just when she starts to let him in, a life-changing choice forces them both to face their deepest fears. Can she finally trust the very thing she spent her whole life running from? Or will her past tear apart the one chance she has at love and healing? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning mist hung thick over Wren Vale like a soft gray blanket. Through the haze, birds called to one another, their songs muffled and distant. Ella Thorne stood in her garden, watching droplets of dew catch the early light on leaves of sage and rosemary. At 26, she had grown used to these quiet moments alone, finding comfort in the gentle stirring of herbs in the morning breeze. Her garden was a wild thing, beautiful in its untamed state. Medicinal plants grew wherever they pleased, climbing over stone walls and spilling onto narrow dirt paths. Ella preferred it this way, natural, free, like the healing knowledge passed down from her grandmother. "Good morning, little ones," she whispered, running her fingers over the fuzzy leaves of lamb's ear. The plant seemed to lean into her touch, and a small smile tugged at her lips. This was her morning ritual, greeting each plant like an old friend, checking for new growth, gently pruning away dead leaves. The crunch of gravel announced visitors. Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Cooper, two of the village elders, made their way up her winding path, carrying their usual offerings. Mrs. Bennet's basket held fresh eggs, still warm from her henhouse, while Mr. Cooper brought his famous sourdough bread, the crust perfectly crisp. "Morning, dear," Mrs. Bennet called out, her voice warm and weathered like old leather. "Brought you breakfast." Ella brushed dirt from her hands and approached them. "You're too kind. Let me get your teas." Inside her cottage, dried herbs hung from wooden beams, filling the air with earthy sweetness. She reached for two carefully labeled jars, chamomile and peppermint blend for Mrs. Bennet's arthritis, and elderberry and thyme for Mr. Cooper's persistent cough. As she measured the dried herbs into paper packets, Mrs. Bennet settled herself at Ella's small kitchen table. "Have you heard? The mobile clinic's set up in the square today. Might be worth a visit, dear. Get that headache of yours looked at properly." Ella's hand stilled for just a moment. "The herbs help well enough," she said softly, not meeting Mrs. Bennet's concerned gaze. "Here's your tea. 2 cups daily, steeped for 5 minutes." "But surely," Mr. Cooper began. "I'm fine, really." Ella's tone was gentle but firm. "Thank you for thinking of me." After they left, Ella buried herself in her work. She trimmed fresh lavender, hanging bundles to dry in the warm kitchen. The repetitive motion of cutting stems and tying twine helped quiet the unease their words had stirred up. By afternoon, the mist had burned away, leaving behind a bright autumn day. Ella could hear the increased bustle from the village square, even from her garden. New voices mixed with familiar ones, carrying whispers of excitement about the visiting doctor. "Did you see Dr. Merrick?" She overheard Mrs. Peterson telling her neighbor as Ella gathered more dried lavender for delivery. "Such a kind young man. Nothing like those rushed city doctors." "Handsome too," her neighbor replied with a laugh. "And the way he is with children. You should have seen him with little Tommy this morning." Ella's shoulders tensed. She tucked the lavender into her basket and took the long way around to avoid the square. But as she passed the edge of the village green, movement caught her eye. Despite herself, she looked. A tall man in a blue shirt was crouched down, eye level with a small girl holding a teddy bear. His smile was gentle as he listened to whatever she was telling him, nodding seriously as if her words held great importance. The sound of their shared laughter floated across the green. Ella ducked her head and quickened her pace, her heart beating faster. She didn't slow until she reached home, closing her door firmly behind her. Evening settled over the village like a heavy quilt. Ella sat alone at her small table, a bowl of leftover vegetable stew growing cold beside her open book, but the words blurred on the page, replaced by unwanted memories. White walls, the sharp smell of disinfectant, the steady beep of monitors turning frantic, her mother's hand, growing cold in hers as alarms screamed. A doctor's clipped voice. We did everything we could. But they hadn't. They hadn't listened when her mother said something was wrong. They hadn't believed her until it was too late. Ella se alejó de la mesa. Su apetito desapareció. She lit a candle and pulled out her journal, its leather cover soft and familiar in her hands. The pages held years of her thoughts, fears, and hopes, though lately more fears than hopes. By candlelight, she wrote, "A doctor in Renvale. I want nothing to do with him." The words looked stark against the cream-colored page, final, certain. A sharp knock at the door made her jump, splattering ink across the page. For a moment, her heart stuttered. But no, it wouldn't be him. She didn't know him, and he didn't know her. When she opened the door, Mrs. Wright, the baker's wife, stood on her porch, cradling her right hand. "I'm so sorry to disturb you this late, Ella. The oven, I wasn't careful enough." "Come in," Ella said, already moving toward her shelves of remedies. This was familiar. This was safe. She selected a jar of burn salve, the beeswax and calendula mixture she'd made last week. "Here," she said, opening the jar. The salve was cool and smooth, smelling faintly of honey. "Apply it 3 times daily. Keep the burn clean and uncovered while you sleep." Mrs. Wright's tension eased as Ella gently spread the salve over the angry red skin. "You're a blessing, dear. What would we do without you?" Ella managed a small smile, carefully rewrapping the burn. This was her place in Renvale, the quiet herbalist, the keeper of grandmother's remedies, the one people came to in need, but left just as quickly. It was better this way, she told herself, safer. But as she closed the door behind Mrs. Wright, the cottage seemed especially quiet, the shadows especially deep. Ella blew out the candle and watched the smoke curl up toward the ceiling, trying not to think about kind smiles or gentle laughter drifting across the village green. The next day, the morning sun cast long shadows across Renvale's winding lanes as Jonah Merrick made his way through the village. His worn leather messenger bag hung at his side, filled with medical pamphlets and his ever-present notebook. He'd always believed that being a good doctor meant knowing your community, not just their ailments. House by house, he introduced himself with a warm smile and genuine interest in each person he met. Mrs. Peterson offered him tea and told him about her grandchildren. The Cooper family shared stories of 3 generations living under one roof. Even shy Mr. Barnes, who rarely spoke to anyone, opened up about his prize-winning tomatoes. When Jonah reached the edge of the village, a cottage caught his eye. Unlike the neat gardens of other homes, this one seemed to blur the line between cultivation and wilderness. Herbs grew in carefully planned chaos, their leaves dancing in the morning breeze. The air was rich with the scent of lavender and thyme. He knocked on the wooden door, weathered gray with age. No answer. Again, softer this time. Still nothing. Jonah stepped back, taking in the property. What looked like disorder from a distance revealed itself as intricate design up close. Medicinal herbs were grouped by purpose, respiratory aids together, pain relievers in another section, sleep-inducing plants in a shaded corner. His mother, the botanist, would have loved this place. Pulling out his notebook, he began to write. Fascinating integration of companion planting principles. Yarrow protecting vulnerable herbs. Marigolds as natural pest control. Evidence of deep traditional knowledge. Near the gate, A plant he'd never seen before caught his attention. Its leaves were silvery green, growing in a spiral pattern up delicate stems. Small white flowers dotted the plant like stars in a night sky. Jonah crouched down, carefully sketching the plant's structure in his notebook. The detail work helped him focus, just as it had during long nights of medical school. Later that morning, the mobile clinic buzzed with activity. Jonah checked Mr. Cooper's persistent cough, gave Tommy Miller his vaccinations without a single tear, thanks to a well-timed joke about penguins, and discussed Mrs. Bennett's arthritis treatment options. When old Mr. Wilson came in for his blood pressure check, he noticed Jonah's sketch. "Ah, that's a beauty you've drawn there," Mr. Wilson said, leaning closer to the notebook. "Though you've labeled it wrong, son. That's not moonflower, it's starlight sage. Rare thing, that is. Ella would scold you proper for mixing those up." Jonah's interest peaked. "Ella?" "Ella Thorne, our village herbalist, lives in that cottage at the edge of town, the one with all the plants." Mr. Wilson's eyes crinkled with affection. "Learned everything from her grandmother, she did. Keeps to herself mostly, but knows more about healing plants than anyone I've ever met." Meanwhile, across the village, Ella pushed her wooden cart through the grocer's door. She needed supplies: honey for salves, beeswax for balms, and basic ingredients for her own meals. The small shop smelled of coffee beans and fresh bread. "He actually listened," Mrs. Peterson was saying to the grocer's wife. "Didn't rush me at all. Asked about Mother's old remedies, too." "Such a change from that last doctor who came through," the grocer's wife agreed. "Dr. Merrick really seems to care." Ella reached for a jar of honey, trying to ignore their conversation. But their words followed her through the store. "Did you see how he was with the Williams baby? So gentle. And he's interested in natural remedies, too. Maybe he and Ella could—" Ella set her jar down harder than necessary. "Just these items, please," she said curtly, cutting off their speculation. The afternoon sun was starting its descent when Jonah returned to the cottage at the edge of town. This time, he found its owner in the garden, carefully pruning rose hips with well-worn shears. She moved with precise grace, each cut deliberate and sure. "Hello," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. "I'm Jonah Merrick, the new doctor at the mobile clinic." Ella straightened slowly, brushing hair from her face with the back of her hand. Her eyes met his, cool and distant as mountain lakes. She said nothing, just waited. "I was here this morning, but you were out." He held up his notebook, open to the sketch. "I was hoping you could help me identify this plant. I thought it was moonflower, but Mr. Wilson suggested I might be wrong." "Starlight sage," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The leaves spiral clockwise. Moonflower grows counterclockwise and has broader leaves." She turned back to her rose hips, clearly considering the conversation over. Jonah nodded, making the correction in his notebook. He could feel her distance, solid as a wall between them. But there was something else too: knowledge, dedication, and maybe a hint of pain beneath her careful composure. "Thank you for the lesson," he said softly, tucking his notebook away. "I'd love to learn more someday." Ella's shears paused mid-cut, but she didn't turn around. Jonah waited a moment longer, then walked away, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Behind him, Ella's hands had stilled on the rose bush. She watched his retreating figure, noting despite herself how he stopped to observe a patch of wild chamomile growing by the road. Only when he disappeared around the bend did she realize she'd been holding her breath. 3 days passed like autumn leaves drifting to the ground, each one carrying its own quiet weight. The morning mist had just begun to lift when Jonah approached Ella's cottage, his footsteps careful and measured on the damp earth. In his hands, he held a leather-bound book, its spine cracked with age and its pages yellowed by time. He stood at her door for a moment, drawing in the crisp morning air. The cottage was silent. Ella was likely on her morning walk, as the villagers had mentioned she always took. Perfect. He placed the book gently on her doorstep, tucking a simple note beneath its cover. Thought you might enjoy this. Page 47. The book itself was a treasure, one he'd inherited from his mother. Its pages held detailed botanical illustrations and careful observations about medicinal plants. He'd spent the previous evening reading through it, remembering how his mother's fingers had traced these same pages, how her voice had brought each plant to life in his childhood. After leaving the book, Jonah lingered by the garden gate, watching the morning light play across the dewy herbs. Then he turned and walked back toward the village, hoping the gesture would speak louder than words. An hour later, Ella returned from her walk, her basket filled with fresh chickweed and morning glory. She spotted the book immediately, its presence as unexpected as frost in summer. Setting her basket down, she picked up the book carefully, as if it might disappear like morning mist. Inside her cottage, Ella placed the book on her wooden table, next to a cup of cooling chamomile tea. She stood there, arms crossed, debating whether to even acknowledge this gesture. The book clearly had age and history. Its leather cover was soft with use, its pages well thumbed, but accepting it felt like opening a door she'd rather keep closed. Finally, curiosity won over caution. She opened the book to page 47, and her breath caught slightly. There, rendered in exquisite detail, was the starlight sage, the very plant Jonah had misidentified. But what made her pause was the notation in the margin, written in careful script. Leaves spiral clockwise. Not moonflower. Ella Thorne. He'd added her correction, acknowledging her knowledge without defensiveness. Several days passed, each one carrying the weight of that unopened conversation. Ella found herself glancing at the book more often than she cared to admit, noting the careful observations, the detailed drawings that reminded her of her grandmother's own journals. When Jonah next passed by her cottage, Ella was in the garden, harvesting late summer herbs. She watched him approach, noting how he slowed his pace, clearly giving her time to retreat if she wished. Instead, surprising herself as much as him, she straightened up and said, "Would you like some tea?" The words hung in the air between them for a moment before Jonah smiled, warm but careful. "I'd like that very much." Inside, Ella moved with practiced efficiency, steeping herbs in 2 mismatched mugs. She chose a blend of lemon balm and mint, calming herbs for her racing heart. Jonah sat at her small table, his presence both foreign and oddly fitting in her quiet space. The silence stretched between them, not entirely uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken words. Ella sat across from him, arms folded across her chest, her own mug untouched. "Thank you for the book," she said finally, her voice quiet but clear. "It was my mother's," Jonah replied, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "She was a botanist, taught me everything I know about plants, which, as you've noticed, still isn't enough." A small smile tugged at the corner of Ella's mouth despite herself. "The starlight sage is tricky. Many people mistake it." "Your greenhouse," Jonah said suddenly, gesturing toward the window where the structure's broken frame was visible. "I couldn't help but notice it. It must have been beautiful once." Ella's posture stiffened slightly, but something in Jonah's genuine interest made her continue. "My grandmother built it," she said, her voice softening with memory. "She taught me everything about healing plants. We spent hours in there, especially during winter storms. She would tell me stories about each plant, their histories, their secrets." She paused, her fingers tightening around her mug. "After she passed, I didn't know how to maintain it properly. The winter storms came and..." She gestured vaguely toward the window, where the greenhouse stood as a testament to loss and time. Jonah listened without interruption, his eyes warm with understanding. He didn't offer empty condolences or try to fill the silence with meaningless words. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging both the love and the loss in her story. When it was time for him to leave, They walked together to the door. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, painting everything in soft gold. Jonah paused by the greenhouse, its broken frame a skeleton of what it once was. He reached out, running a hand along the weathered wood, testing its strength with gentle fingers. "I've built things before," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I could help, if you'd let me." Ella stood in her doorway, watching as he walked away, his offer hanging in the air like autumn leaves before the fall. That evening, for the first time in years, her journal remained closed on her desk. Instead, she sat by the window, the borrowed book in her lap, its presence both comforting and unsettling. Her fingers traced the edge of page 47, lingering on Jonah's careful handwriting. The moonlight filtered through her window, casting soft shadows across the pages, and she found herself wondering what secrets page 48 might hold. But she didn't turn the page, not yet. Instead, she sat in the quiet of her cottage, listening to the night sounds and feeling, for the first time in a long while, the possibility of change in the air. The next morning arrived wrapped in a gentle drizzle, the kind that made the world feel soft and muted. Droplets collected on spider webs between the herbs, turning them into delicate strings of pearls. Ella was kneeling in her garden, gathering wet sage leaves, when she heard the familiar crunch of boots on gravel. Jonah appeared at her gate, but not as the doctor she'd grown accustomed to seeing from afar. Today, he wore a worn navy sweater with patches on the elbows, carrying gardening gloves and what looked like old blueprints rolled under his arm. His boots were caked with mud, and his usual professional demeanor had been replaced by something more casual, more genuine. Ella se enderezó lentamente, limpiando sus manos en su delantal. She'd been thinking about his offer since yesterday, turning it over in her mind like a smooth river stone. The greenhouse needed work. That was undeniable. And something about seeing him there, dressed for hard work rather than medical rounds, made her defenses slip just slightly. She let out a small sigh, but nodded toward the greenhouse. "Start with the eastern beam," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "It's the most unstable." They fell into work naturally, moving around each other with careful awareness. The conversation came in fragments, mostly about plants, safe territory for them both. Ella explained how certain herbs needed specific angles of sunlight, while Jonah shared techniques for strengthening the frame without disturbing the root systems below. "My mother used to say that fieldwork was the best teacher," Jonah mentioned as he secured a loose board, his voice casual, but his eyes focused intently on his task. She'd spend weeks tracking down specific species, camping in all sorts of weather. He didn't elaborate further, didn't even mention his mother's name, but Ella caught the note of pride and loss in his voice. The morning stretched into afternoon, the drizzle creating a peaceful rhythm on the remaining glass panes. During a break, they sat on Ella's porch steps, drinking water from mason jars. The silence between them felt less charged now, softened by shared work and purpose. "Have you always lived here?" Jonah asked, his question gentle but direct. Ella's fingers tightened around her jar. The question seemed simple enough, but it opened doors she usually kept firmly closed. She looked out at the misty garden, at the half-repaired greenhouse, and something in her shifted slightly. "No," she said finally. "I lived in the city once, with my mother." She paused, gathering her thoughts like gathering herbs, carefully, purposefully. She got sick, something simple, an infection. But the doctor, her voice caught slightly. He didn't listen when she described her symptoms, dismissed them as anxiety. By the time someone took it seriously, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The weight of loss hung heavy in the damp air between them. Jonah sat very still, his face showing the impact of her words. He didn't offer platitudes or defenses of his profession. He simply listened, bearing witness to her pain with quiet respect. They returned to work, the physical labor a welcome distraction from heavy memories. The afternoon light was starting to fade when Jonah, replacing one of the cracked window panes, suddenly drew in a sharp breath. Blood welled up from a clean slice across his palm where the glass had caught him. Ella moved without thinking. Years of treating villagers' cuts and burns had made her responses automatic. She took his hand in hers, examining the wound with practiced eyes. It was the first time she had touched him, and some distant part of her mind registered the warmth of his skin, the strength in his fingers. Leading him to her workbench, she quickly gathered what she needed. Yarrow to stop the bleeding, calendula for healing, clean bandages she always kept ready. Her movements were swift and sure as she pressed the herbs against the cut and wrapped the bandage with skilled hands. "Thank you," Jonah said softly, watching her work. There was something in his voice she couldn't quite read. Respect, perhaps, or understanding. As dusk began to settle over the garden, they stood back to admire their work. The greenhouse's skeleton stood upright again, its frame secure even if some panes still needed replacing. The structure looked more hopeful now, less like a monument to loss, and more like a promise of renewal. Jonah lingered, his bandaged hand resting lightly on one of the newly secured beams. "I know you don't trust doctors," he said softly, his words barely louder than the evening breeze. "But I'm not here to fix anyone. I came because something about this place felt important." Ella looked at him then, really looked at him, at the mud on his boots, the honest work in his hands, the careful way he held himself in her space. "You still don't know half of it," she said, but there was less edge to her words than there might have been yesterday. She hesitated for a moment, then added, "I have leftover stew if you're hungry." Jonah's face softened into a smile. "I'd like that," he said simply. Days later, the morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the worn pages of the leather-bound journal in Jonah's hands. He sat on a fallen log at the edge of the forest trail, his breath creating small clouds in the crisp air. It was early, so early that dew still clung to every surface, and the birds were just beginning their morning songs. He traced his finger along the faded ink of his mother's handwriting, reading the passage he'd returned to countless times since arriving in Wrenvale. The words were familiar now, but they held new meaning. "Met the most remarkable child today in Wrenvale, a barefoot girl who knew every plant in what she called her wild garden. Such wisdom in those young eyes. The way she spoke about the herbs reminded me of the old healers." Jonah closed his eyes briefly, remembering Ella's careful movements in her garden, the sure way she handled each plant, the depth of knowledge in her quick corrections of his mistakes. The pieces were fitting together like a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. With careful fingers, he found the page where his mother had sketched the garden. The drawing was detailed, typical of his mother's scientific precision, showing intricate patterns of wildflowers that wrapped around wooden beams. The same patterns he'd noticed yesterday while working in Ella's greenhouse. His hands hesitated for just a moment before he slowly, deliberately tore the page from the journal. The sound of ripping paper seemed too loud in the quiet morning. He folded the sketch carefully, his movements precise, and tucked it into his coat pocket. The weight of it felt significant, like a secret he wasn't sure he should keep. Later that morning, he made his way to Ella's cottage, his footsteps intentionally casual despite the nervous energy humming through him. He'd brought along his notebook, filled with sketches of local plants he claimed to need help identifying. It wasn't entirely a lie. He did want to learn, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Ella was already in the greenhouse when he arrived, her hair tied back with a faded ribbon, dirt smudged on one cheek. She looked up as he entered, and something in her expression had softened since yesterday. "Back again?" she asked, but there was no edge to her words. "If you don't mind," he replied, holding up his notebook. "I could use some help with these identifications." She nodded toward the workbench where dozens of small cloth bags lay spread out. "I'm sorting seeds," she said. "You can help if you want. We can talk about your plants while we work." They fell into an easy rhythm, their hands moving steadily through the seeds while Jonah asked questions about various plants. But his attention kept drifting to the wooden beams above them, to the carved wildflower patterns that matched the sketch in his pocket perfectly. His mother had sat in this very spot once, drawing those same flowers, probably talking with a young Ella about healing and herbs. "You're distracted," Ella observed, breaking into his thoughts. She was watching him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see more than he intended to show. Jonah's hand instinctively touched his coat pocket where the sketch lay hidden. "Just thinking of my mother," he said, which wasn't exactly a lie. She would have loved this place. He looked around the greenhouse, trying to see it through his mother's eyes. "The way you've organized everything, the knowledge you have." It would have fascinated her. Ella's expression softened further, and she handed him another bag of seeds to sort. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the afternoon light creating patterns through the newly cleaned glass panes. When the sun began to set, Jonah made his way back to the clinic. The small building was quiet now, the day's patients long gone. He sat at his desk and pulled out his medical notebook, a stark contrast to the natural chaos of Ella's greenhouse with its clean lines and precise notes. The torn sketch felt heavy in his hands as he carefully pinned it to the inside back cover of the notebook. His mother's detailed drawing of the wildflower patterns seemed to blur before his eyes as he struggled with his decision. Should he tell Ella about the connection, about how his mother had written about her, had been touched by her childhood wisdom? Or should he let things unfold naturally, let Ella come to trust him on her own terms? He traced the drawn flowers with one finger, remembering how the real ones looked carved into the greenhouse beams. The truth felt like a seed itself, one that needed the right conditions to grow. Meanwhile, in her cottage, Ella moved through her evening routine with unusual thoughtfulness. She stirred the pot of soup on her stove, then reached into her cupboard for dishes. Without fully examining her actions, she placed 2 cups on her small table, something she hadn't done since her grandmother passed away. The second cup sat empty throughout her meal, catching the last rays of sunlight through her window. When she finished eating, she stared at it for a long moment, her face unreadable in the growing darkness. Then, quietly, she picked it up and put it away, her movements careful and deliberate in the silence of her home. Sometimes later, the morning sun had barely risen when urgent knocking echoed through Jonah's small clinic. He opened the door to find Thomas, one of the local farmers, his face etched with worry. "Doctor, Merrick, please. It's my boy Micah. The fever won't break, and his cough." Thomas's voice cracked. "We went to Ella first, yesterday evening. Her remedies usually work wonders, but this time..." He shook his head helplessly. Jonah grabbed his medical bag without hesitation. "Take me to him." The farmhouse sat nestled against rolling hills, usually peaceful, but now filled with tension. Inside, Micah lay on a small bed, his normally energetic frame unnaturally still. His mother Sarah sat beside him, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. In the corner, Ella stood with her arms wrapped around herself, her face drawn with concern. Jonah moved quickly to Micah's bedside, his manner calm but focused. The boy's breathing was labored, each inhale accompanied by a worrying rattle. His skin burned hot to the touch, and his lips had taken on a slightly bluish tinge. "How long has he been like this?" Jonah asked, pulling out his stethoscope. "The fever started 2 days ago," Sarah answered, her voice trembling. "But last night it got so much worse. Ella's been here since dawn, trying everything she knows." Jonah glanced at Ella, who met his eyes with unexpected vulnerability. "The fever keeps climbing," she said quietly. "My cooling herbs aren't touching it. And that cough..." Jonah listened to Micah's chest, his expression growing serious. "He needs antibiotics," he said, "and proper monitoring. We should move him to the clinic." Thomas and Sarah exchanged worried looks but nodded. As they prepared to transport Micah, Jonah was surprised to see Ella gathering her herb bags. "I'm coming too," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "There might still be ways I can help." At the clinic, they worked with unexpected synchronicity. Jonah set up an IV line while Ella crushed herbs for a compress, their movements coordinated as if they'd done this many times before. There was no competition, no tension, just two healers focused entirely on helping a sick child. "The antibiotics will fight the infection," Jonah explained as he administered the medicine. "But it will take time to work." Ella nodded, laying her cool compress across Micah's chest. "This blend will help ease his breathing while we wait," she said. "Time for the cough, peppermint to help clear his airways, chamomile to calm him." Hours passed. Thomas and Sarah dozed in chairs while Jonah and Ella maintained their quiet vigil. They moved around each other with natural ease, checking vital signs, adjusting compresses, preparing fresh tea when needed. Their communication was minimal but effective. A gesture here, a nod there, working together as if they'd always known how. As afternoon faded into evening, Micah's fever finally began to break. His breathing eased, the terrible rattle in his chest softening. When he opened his eyes briefly, asking for water in a weak voice, everyone in the room seemed to exhale at once. "The worst is past," Jonah said softly, checking Micah's temperature one more time. "He'll need to stay here tonight for monitoring, but he's going to be fine." Sarah burst into tears of relief while Thomas wrapped her in a tight embrace. Ella stood back, watching the family with gentle eyes, her hand still holding a fresh batch of healing tea. Jonah approached her quietly. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "Your knowledge made a real difference today. Those breathing treatments, the way you knew exactly which herbs would complement the medication, it was incredible." Ella se encogió de hombros, pero su postura defensiva habitual estaba notablemente ausente. "I just did what I could," she said, but she didn't move away from his presence like she usually did. They stayed until Micah was sleeping peacefully, his parents settled in beside him for the night. Outside, the sky had darkened to deep purple, stars beginning to peek through. "Let me walk you home," Jonah offered, and to his surprise, Ella nodded. They walked in comfortable silence through the village, their footsteps synchronized on the familiar path to her cottage. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of evening primrose that bloomed along the roadside. As they reached her gate, Ella paused. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. "You didn't try to push me away in there, or make me feel small." Jonah turned to face her, his expression gentle in the growing darkness. "Why would I? You saved him too." She nodded slowly, considering his words. Then, in a voice that held both hesitation and hope, she asked, "Can you stay a bit?" They settled on her porch steps, shoulders not quite touching but close enough to share the peaceful quiet of the evening. Above them, stars emerged one by one, painting the sky with silver light. Ella's usual tense posture gradually relaxed, her breathing falling into rhythm with the gentle night sounds around them. Neither felt the need to fill the silence with words. They simply sat together, two healers who had found unexpected common ground in their shared care for a sick child. The stars continued their slow dance overhead, witnesses to this moment of perfect stillness. This first time Ella allowed herself to truly rest in Jonah's presence. The morning dawned gray and wet, with rain drumming steadily against the newly repaired greenhouse roof. Droplets traced silver paths down the fresh window panes, creating intricate patterns that caught the dim light. Inside her cottage, Ella was already awake, sorting through dried herbs when she heard footsteps approaching through the rain. Jonah appeared at her door, his dark hair dampened by the rain, holding a brown paper bag that was slightly wet at the corners and two takeaway cups balanced carefully in a carrier. His sweater was dotted with raindrops, but his smile was warm despite the gloomy weather. Thought we could both use breakfast, he said, holding up his offerings. After yesterday, I mean. Ella found herself returning his smile, surprising herself with how natural it felt. The greenhouse might be drier, she suggested, reaching for her shawl. They made their way across the wet garden path to the greenhouse, where the rain created a soothing rhythm on the glass above. Inside, the air was warm and humid, filled with the rich scent of damp earth and growing things. The newly replaced beams stood strong against the weather, and the fresh glass sparkled with beads of water. Jonah set out their breakfast on a weathered wooden table near the back. The paper bag revealed still warm pastries from the village bakery, golden croissants, and fruit-filled danishes that filled the air with their buttery scent. The tea steamed invitingly in its cups. As they settled onto the worn wooden stools, Jonah pulled out a leather-bound sketchbook from his bag. "I've been practicing," he said, a touch of self-consciousness in his voice as he opened it to reveal several attempted botanical drawings. Ella leaned closer to look, a croissant halfway to her mouth. The first sketch was meant to be yarrow, but the leaf structure was all wrong. The second, supposedly chamomile, looked more like daisies. She couldn't help the soft laugh that escaped her. "Oh dear," she said, trying to be diplomatic but failing. That's not quite right." Jonah grinned, clearly not offended. "Show me where I went wrong." Ella picked up his pencil, her fingers brushing his as she took it. She began making corrections, explaining as she went. "Yarrow leaves are more feathered, see? And chamomile has these distinctive segments here." Their heads bent together over the sketchbook. They worked through each drawing. Jonah's attempts were earnest if inaccurate, and Ella found herself enjoying the task of teaching him. The rain continued its gentle percussion above them, creating a cozy bubble around their shared moment. As they finished the last pastry, their conversation flowed more easily than ever before. Ella found herself sharing stories she hadn't told anyone in years. "My grandmother always said plants choose their healers," she said, absently trailing her fingers along a pot of mint. She'd tell me how certain herbs would practically jump into her basket when she went foraging, while others would hide away until the right person came along. Jonah listened intently, his eyes warm with interest. "Did they choose you?" "According to Gran, they did. She said she knew I'd be a healer when she found me at age 3, having a very serious conversation with her lavender bushes." Ella sonrió al recordar, sorprendida por cuánto quería compartirlo con él. "What about you?" she asked, suddenly curious. "How did you choose medicine?" Jonah's expression grew thoughtful as he traced the rim of his empty teacup. "I almost didn't stick with it," he admitted. "Lost my first patient about 2 years into my residency. A young woman, not much older than we are now. I did everything right, followed every protocol, but sometimes..." He shook his head. "I packed up my office the next day, ready to quit." "What stopped you?" "I was walking out of the hospital, and this elderly man stopped me. He'd been a patient of mine months before. Nothing serious, just needed some routine care. He told me how my taking time to really listen to him had made him feel human again, not just another case file." Jonah's voice softened. "Something about that moment. I couldn't walk away after that. Medicine kept pulling me back." The rain had softened to a gentle patter, letting weak sunlight filter through the glass. Ella stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "Want to learn something else?" she asked, gesturing to the prepared soil beds along the greenhouse wall. "Absolutely," Jonah replied, standing to join her. Ella gathered packets of calendula seeds, explaining as she worked. "These need to be planted just so, not too deep, not too shallow. They're particular about their spacing too." She demonstrated the technique, creating small furrows in the rich soil with practiced movements. Jonah watched carefully before attempting to mirror her actions, his medical precision somewhat at odds with the organic nature of the task. "Like this?" he asked, his furrow slightly crooked. Almost, Ella said, leaning in to guide his hands. More like... Their fingers met in the cool soil, and something electric seemed to pass between them. Neither pulled away. For a moment they remained still, connected by that simple touch, surrounded by the gentle sound of rain and the green scent of growing things. They continued planting in comfortable silence, working their way down the row. The air felt charged with something new and delicate, like the moment before a flower opens. As the light began to fade outside, they finished the last of the planting. Ella brushed soil from her hands, aware of Jonah still standing close beside her. When she looked up, his expression made her breath catch, tender and uncertain all at once. He moved slowly, giving her every chance to step away. But Ella remained still, her heart thundering in her chest as he leaned down. When his lips met hers, the kiss was gentle, questioning, filled with all the things they hadn't said. His hand came up to cup her cheek, soil-smudged fingers leaving the faintest trace of earth against her skin. The kiss lasted only moments, but it felt like time had suspended around them. When Jonah finally pulled back, his eyes searched hers, waiting for her reaction. Ella no se mudó. "I should go," he said softly, though he made no immediate move to leave. Ella asintió, no confiando en sí misma para hablar. She watched as he gathered his things and made his way to the greenhouse door, pausing there for one last look before stepping out into the evening air. Long after he'd gone, Ella remained in the greenhouse. The rain had stopped, leaving everything washed clean and new. She sat beside the newly planted calendula bed, her fingers resting on the spot where their hands had touched in the soil, surrounded by the quiet whispers of growing things and the lingering warmth of that kiss. The days that followed their first kiss settled into a gentle pattern, as natural as the changing of seasons. Each evening, after the clinic's doors closed and the last patient had gone home, Jonah would make his way down the winding path to Ella's cottage. Sometimes he carried small offerings, fresh bread from the bakery, interesting leaves he'd found on his morning walks, or medical journals with articles about herbal treatments he thought might interest her. Ella found herself watching the clock as evening approached, her hands stilling in their work as she listened for his familiar footsteps on the garden path. She'd grown used to his presence in her space, the way he carefully removed his boots at the door, how he remembered which herbs needed harvesting, and the gentle way he handled her grandmother's old gardening tools. They worked side by side in comfortable silence most evenings, their movements becoming synchronized over time. Jonah learned to anticipate when she needed the watering can refilled or which basket she'd reach for next. Sometimes their hands would brush as they worked, and the contact no longer made Ella flinch or pull away. The villagers noticed the change in both of them. Mrs. Bennett, the baker's wife, smiled knowingly when Ella came to buy bread, especially on the days Jonah had already been in to purchase his own loaf. The grocer's teenage daughter giggled behind her hand when she saw them walking together through the village square. Even old Mr. Thompson, who rarely spoke to anyone, nodded approvingly when he saw Jonah carrying supplies to help repair Ella's garden fence. When people made comments or cast knowing looks, Ella neither confirmed nor denied anything. She simply continued her work, though sometimes with a slight flush to her cheeks that hadn't been there before. She wasn't ready to put a name to whatever was growing between them, delicate as the first spring shoots pushing through soil. Some evenings, Jonah stayed for dinner. Ella found herself cooking for two more often, adding extra vegetables to her stews and setting out 2 plates without having to think about it. They'd eat at her small kitchen table, talking about their days or sitting in comfortable silence. Sometimes Jonah would share stories about difficult cases at the clinic, and Ella would suggest herbal remedies that might complement his treatments. Their different approaches to healing began to weave together, like 2 streams joining to form a stronger river. On a particularly warm evening, they were harvesting lemon balm together in the last light of day. The herb's citrusy scent filled the air as they carefully cut the stems and bundled them for drying. But something felt different. Jonah's movements were mechanical, lacking their usual care and attention. His responses to Ella's comments came delayed, as if his mind were somewhere far away. Ella noticed how he kept checking his pocket watch, how his brow furrowed when he thought she wasn't looking. The easy rhythm they'd developed felt slightly offbeat, like music played just a fraction too slow. She wanted to ask what was troubling him, but held back. Their relationship, whatever it was, still felt too new and fragile for such direct questions. Instead, she worked quietly beside him, occasionally brushing her hand against his arm or sharing small observations about the plants. "The lemon balm's especially fragrant today," she said softly, holding out a leaf for him to smell. Jonah managed to smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. As they finished bundling the herbs, Jonah's hands trembled slightly, causing him to drop several stems. Ella pretended not to notice as she helped him gather them up. When he left that evening, his goodbye kiss seemed distracted, almost hesitant. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Ella gathered a basket of dried herbs she'd prepared for the clinic: chamomile for sleep, peppermint for nausea, and elderberry for immune support. She'd been providing these supplements more frequently since Jonah arrived, as he'd shown genuine interest in incorporating them into his treatments. Walking toward the clinic, Ella heard Jonah's voice through the partially open window. He was on the phone, his tone serious and professional. "Yes, I understand the opportunity. No, 2 weeks isn't much time. I'm not sure. No, I haven't told her yet." The words hit Ella like a physical force, stopping her in her tracks. The basket suddenly felt heavy in her hands. She didn't wait to hear more, didn't want to eavesdrop on whatever secret Jonah was keeping. Instead, she turned and walked quickly back home, leaving the herbs untouched on her kitchen counter. That evening, she didn't watch the clock. She didn't listen for footsteps on the path. She worked in her garden until the light faded, then went inside and prepared a simple dinner for one. As she reached for a plate, her hand brushed against the second cup she'd grown used to taking down. She left it in the cupboard, its absence on her table speaking louder than words. Ella ate alone, the quiet of her cottage pressing in around her. The empty chair across from her seemed to mock the comfortable routine she'd foolishly begun to rely on. She thought of all the things left unsaid between them, her growing feelings, his apparent secrets, the fragile trust they'd been building. Now it all felt uncertain, like morning mist that could disappear with the first strong breeze. After dinner, she cleaned her single plate and cup, putting them away with mechanical precision. The herbs she'd meant to deliver still sat in their basket, their healing properties useless against this particular kind of hurt. Through her window, she could see the greenhouse where they'd shared their first kiss, its glass panels reflecting the last light of day. Inside, the calendula they'd planted together was beginning to sprout, unaware that anything had changed. The next day, the morning sun cast long shadows across Ella's garden, but she barely noticed its warmth. Her hands moved mechanically through familiar tasks, grinding dried herbs with more force than necessary. The pestle struck the mortar with sharp, angry sounds that echoed her turbulent thoughts. Lavender, normally so soothing, couldn't calm her racing mind. She threw herself into work with single-minded determination. The shelves of her cottage needed organizing. Again. Glass bottles clinked against each other as she rearranged them, checking labels she'd written just days ago. Chamomile, echinacea, elderberry. Each one reminded her of recent conversations with Jonah about combining traditional and modern medicine. She pushed those memories aside and focused on straightening each bottle until they formed perfect rows. Outside, the garden called for attention. Ella attacked the overgrown areas with pruning shears, cutting back branches and vines with unprecedented vigor. The roses didn't need such severe trimming, but she couldn't stop herself. Thorns caught at her sleeves and scratched her arms, but she barely felt the sting. Better to feel that than the hollow ache in her chest. When villagers passed by with their usual greetings, she responded with short nods. Mrs. Bennet stopped to ask if she'd be making her usual delivery to the clinic today. Ella shook her head, mumbling something about being too busy. She didn't meet the older woman's concerned gaze. Mid-morning, she heard Jonah's footsteps approaching on the path. Her hands stilled momentarily in their work, but she didn't look up. He paused at her garden gate, and she could feel his eyes on her. "Good morning," he said, his voice careful, measured. "Morning," she replied, continuing to prune a perfectly healthy rosemary bush. "I missed you at the clinic today." "Busy here." The words came out clipped, matching the sharp snips of her shears. A long pause followed. Ella could sense him struggling to find the right words, but she refused to make it easier. Let him tell her about the job offer. Let him be honest about leaving. Instead, he said, "The feverfew you gave Mrs. Thompson last week worked wonders for her headaches." "Good to hear." Snip. Snip. Another healthy branch fell. "Ella." He started, then stopped. The silence stretched between them like a physical barrier. "I should get back to work," she said finally, still not meeting his eyes. "Right. Of course." His footsteps retreated slowly down the path. The day dragged on, each hour feeling longer than the last. As evening approached, Ella heard him return. This time, she was in the greenhouse, methodically repotting seedlings that didn't really need it. The glass walls glowed with the golden light of sunset, the same light that had made everything seem so possible just days ago. Jonah entered quietly, closing the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, watching her work. The air felt thick with unspoken words. "The calendula's coming up nicely," he said, gesturing to the sprouts they'd planted together. Ella continued transferring a perfectly healthy plant to a new pot. "Yes." He moved closer, picking up an empty pot and turning it in his hands. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." "You're leaving, aren't you?" The words came out steady, calmer than she felt. She finally looked up at him, meeting his startled gaze. Jonah set down the pot, his hands trembling slightly. "How did you—" "I heard you on the phone yesterday." She brushed soil from her hands, the gesture deliberate and controlled. "When were you planning to tell me?" He ran a hand through his hair, looking lost. "I was trying to figure out how. It's complicated. Seems simple enough to me. You got a better offer." "I don't want to leave," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But this opportunity, it's something meaningful. A chance to bridge traditional healing with modern medicine, to make real change." Ella nodded, her face carefully blank. "I hope you find what you're looking for." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. "Ella, please." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, busying herself with the seedlings again. "You should go," she said quietly. "It's getting late." Jonah stood there for a long moment as if waiting for her to say more. When she didn't, he turned and walked slowly to the door. He paused there, looking back at her one last time, but she kept her eyes fixed on her work. The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the growing darkness. Hours passed. Ella remained in the greenhouse until the last light faded, going through the motions of caring for plants that didn't need tending. When she finally stepped outside, something on her porch caught her eye. A leather-bound journal, its pages ruffled slightly in the evening breeze. As she picked it up, the first drops of rain began to fall. Inside her cottage, she lit a candle and settled into her grandmother's old chair. The journal's pages were filled with neat handwriting and detailed botanical sketches. She recognized Jonah's mother's name on the inside cover. The journal fell open naturally to a well-worn page, and Ella began to read. The entry described a visit to Wrenvale years ago, when the writer had encountered a remarkable young girl in a wild garden. The description was unmistakable. The barefoot child with herb-stained fingers, the way she spoke to plants as if they were friends, how she knew every leaf and flower by name. "The child reminds me so much of myself at that age," the entry read. "Such wisdom in one so young. I hope my son finds his way here someday. There's something magical about this place, about that little wild gardener. Something that could heal a heart." Ella's vision blurred as she continued reading. The journal contained detailed observations about the garden, about her grandmother's teachings, about the perfect balance of wild and cultivated plants. Each page revealed how deeply Jonah's mother had understood and respected what she'd found here. By the time she reached the final entry, tears were falling freely onto the aged paper. Outside, the rain continued to fall, its steady rhythm matching the ache in her heart. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls of her suddenly too quiet cottage. The last page held a pressed flower, a sprig of lemon balm, still fragrant after all these years. Beneath it, in fading ink, were the words, "Remember this place. Remember that little girl. Some gardens grow more than just plants. They grow hope, healing, and love." The morning mist clung to Renvale like a farewell embrace. Jonah stood beside the clinic van, methodically loading boxes of medical supplies and personal belongings. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if each item carried the weight of his decision. Mrs. Thompson approached first, her weathered hands clutching a basket of fresh scones. "For the journey," she said, her eyes misty. "You've done so much for us, Dr. Merrick." "Thank you," Jonah replied softly, accepting the basket. The scones were still warm, reminding him of shared breakfasts in Ella's greenhouse. More villagers trickled in as the morning progressed. Mr. Bennett brought coffee in a thermos. The baker's wife arrived with bread still dusted with flour. Each farewell felt like another thread pulling tight around Jonah's heart. Old Martha, who rarely left her cottage nowadays, made her way slowly toward him with the help of her cane. In her free hand, she held a single wildflower, blue and delicate against her dark sleeve. "Here," she said, pressing the flower into his palm. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, fixed on his face. "Don't leave all your roots behind, dear boy. Some things are worth more than grand opportunities." Jonah carefully placed the wildflower between the pages of his medical notebook, next to his mother's sketch. His throat felt tight. Meanwhile, across the village, Ella sat alone in the newly restored greenhouse. Morning light filtered through the glass panels they had replaced together, casting prism patterns on the wooden floor. Her grandmother's rocking chair creaked softly as she opened Jonah's mother's journal again. The pages fell open naturally to the sketch, her younger self, wild-haired and barefoot, tending to plants with complete absorption. The artist had captured something Ella had forgotten about herself. The pure joy she'd once found in simply being among her beloved herbs and flowers. Her fingers traced the careful lines of the drawing, then moved to the final entry. The words seemed to pulse with new meaning now. "If she's anything like the girl I met, she won't let you stay, unless you give her a reason." Ella's eyes burned. She remembered that day now. Jonah's mother asking endless questions about the plants, treating her like an equal despite her age, sharing stories about her own garden back home. She had mentioned her son then, hadn't she? A boy who loved both science and nature, who wanted to heal people but struggled with the coldness of modern medicine. The sound of an approaching vehicle made her stomach clench. Footsteps on her porch, then a gentle knock. "Ella?" Jonah's voice was soft, uncertain. She moved to the door but couldn't bring herself to open it. Her hand rested against the worn wood, and she imagined his doing the same on the other side. "I have to go," he said. "The hospital needs an answer by tomorrow." Ella pressed her forehead against the door. "Do what you need to," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But know that I wasn't afraid of doctors. I was afraid of trusting one again." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, she heard him sigh, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. Through her window, Ella watched the clinic van pull away, disappearing down the winding road that led out of Wrenvale. The valley stretched before it, morning mist still clinging to the trees. Jonah drove mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Each curve in the road seemed to pull at him, urging him to turn around. Halfway to the city, he pulled over at a small turnout overlooking the valley. The medical notebook sat heavy in his coat pocket. He took it out, opening to where the wildflower lay pressed between the pages. Next to it, his mother's sketch showed the garden as it had been, wild and alive with possibility. The same garden he had helped rebuild, the same garden where he had first kissed Ella. The wildflower's petals were the exact shade of blue as the morning glory that grew along Ella's fence. Old Martha's words echoed in his mind. "Don't leave all your roots behind." Jonah stared at the flower for a long moment. Then, with sudden determination, he started the van and turned it around. The sun was setting when Ella heard footsteps again, quick, urgent steps coming up her path. Her heart recognized the rhythm before her mind did. She opened the door. Jonah stood there, slightly out of breath, his eyes full of everything he hadn't said before. The last rays of sunlight caught in his disheveled hair, and his medical coat was missing. "I don't want to fix you, Ella," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want to grow with you." She stepped outside, closing the distance between them. This time when they kissed, there was no hesitation, no questioning. It felt like coming home. The late summer breeze carried the sweet scent of healing herbs through the restored greenhouse. Sunlight streamed through spotless glass panels, creating a kaleidoscope of warmth across the wooden floors. Where broken beams and shattered panes once stood, strength and clarity now reigned. The transformation wasn't just in the structure, it lived in the people who had rebuilt it. Ella moved between the neat rows of herbs, her fingers brushing lovingly against leaves of sage and thyme. The plants seemed to lean into her touch, their vitality evident in deep greens and vigorous growth. She paused to adjust a climbing rose that had strayed from its trellis, smiling at the sound of Jonah's voice drifting through the open door. He was outside, explaining to Mrs. Thompson's grandson how Yarrow could help his scraped knee. "But first," she heard him say, "we'll clean it properly and make sure there's nothing stuck inside. Then we'll use both, medicine and nature working together." The Wellness Grove had become exactly what they'd hoped, a place where science and tradition danced together instead of fighting for dominance. The waiting room of their joint practice held both modern medical equipment and dried herbs hanging from rough-hewn beams. The examination table sat near windows overlooking the herb gardens, and the dispensary contained both pharmaceutical medications and Ella's carefully crafted tinctures. Instead of insurance forms, patients brought what they could: fresh eggs, homemade bread, sometimes just sincere thanks and a handful of wildflowers. The village had embraced their unique approach with surprising enthusiasm. Even old Mr. Collins, who'd initially scoffed at witch doctor nonsense, now specifically requested Ella's chamomile blend alongside his heart medication. In the garden, children played along the stone paths that wound between raised beds. Their laughter mixed with the buzz of bees and the rustle of leaves. Two young girls carefully watered the calendula under Ella's watchful eye, while a boy nearby sketched plants in a notebook just like Jonah's. "Miss Ella," called Sarah, one of the young gardeners, "is this enough water for the flowers?" Ella se arrodilló junto a ella, colocando su mano en la tierra. "What do you think the plant is telling you?" Sarah closed her eyes in concentration, mimicking Ella's familiar gesture. "It feels happy. Not too wet or dry." "Perfect," Ella nodded, her heart warming at how naturally the children absorbed these lessons. "You're learning to listen. Inside the clinic portion of their space, Jonah was finishing up with his last patient of the day. Mrs. Bennett had brought him a bunch of wildflowers, adding to the colorful collection that already brightened his desk. As she left, she patted his hand. "Such a blessing, having both of you here. My arthritis hasn't felt this good in years." Jonah smiled, arranging the fresh flowers in a mason jar. His medical degrees hung on the wall beside dried herb bundles and anatomical charts. A drawing of the human circulatory system was annotated with both scientific terms and the traditional herbs that supported each part, a perfect visualization of their combined approach. The afternoon light softened as they prepared to close for the day. Ella organized her dried herbs while Jonah updated patient records, their movements around each other as natural as breathing. They had developed a rhythm that felt as old as the earth itself, modern precision dancing with ancient wisdom. Above the greenhouse door, the new wooden sign swayed gently in the evening breeze. "The Heart of Wrenvale," it proclaimed in hand-carved letters, decorated with intertwined symbols of medicine and nature. A caduceus wrapped in flowering vines. The sign had been a gift from the village carpenter, presented with tears in his eyes after they had helped his wife through a difficult pregnancy, using both modern medicine and traditional remedies. As twilight approached, they closed up shop together. Ella extinguished the candles in the greenhouse while Jonah locked the clinic door. The day's last rays of sunshine painted the glass walls in shades of amber and rose, and the first fireflies began to emerge from the garden shadows. They settled into their familiar spots on the porch, 2 cups of evening tea steaming on the small table between them. The wooden steps still held the day's warmth, and the garden before them pulsed with life. Crickets began their evening symphony as more fireflies rose from the herbs, dancing like stars come down to earth. Jonah leaned over, resting his head on Ella's shoulder. The gesture was comfortable, natural, the easy affection of 2 people who had found their way home to each other. His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. The garden stretched out before them, a living testament to their partnership. Every plant, every pathway, every beam of the greenhouse held memories of their journey together. The roots they'd planted ran deep, not just in the soil, but in each other's lives and in the heart of the community they served. Ella apretó su mano suavemente, una sonrisa jugando en sus labios. "I still don't trust doctors," she said, her voice warm with affection and teasing. Jonah's answering grin was visible even in the gathering dusk. "Good," he replied, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "I'm not just a doctor anymore." They sat together in comfortable silence, their joined hands resting between them. Around them, the garden continued its evening dance, herbs swaying in the breeze, fireflies weaving through the air, the greenhouse glass reflecting the first emerging stars. In this moment, in this place they had built together, nothing was missing. Their love, like the roots beneath their feet, grew strong and steady in the fertile soil of trust and understanding they had cultivated together. If you enjoyed the story of Ella and Jonah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.